Next, I'm delighted to turn to Richard Gledhill, who is one of the commissioners of the Independent Commission on Aid Impact, ICAI. When I first heard ICAI, I wondered what this berry was doing in the parliamentary oversight system. Richard joined ICAI last year, so he's not going to talk about the very interesting ICAI report that was written on DFID's approach to the private sector. It came out, I think, just over a year ago. But I think that report is very interesting background for today, because it's saying, actually, if we're going to really ramp up support for the private sector, DFID needs to be much clearer on it. So to me, it reinforces the strategic and oversight issues that are going on in this space. Richard is going to update us on what ICAI are about to do, just briefly without going into any of the content, but also brings a wealth of experience from climate finance. And I think the climate world it's got several years ahead of us in the development world at thinking of how to leverage public finance for real impact. And I'm sure there's a lot we can learn from the climate world. So, Richard, over to you.
Thanks, Caroline. I should say the reason why I'm not going to talk about the Business and Development Report is because we're in the process of doing a follow-up review. Each of the ICAI reports, we come back to a year later and see what DFID or the other government departments have done in response to our recommendations. So it's not that I don't want to talk about it, but you'll be able to read all about it in a couple of months' time when we issue our review of the year. The speakers got together just before the first panel, and Caroline said to us that if you were meeting the IDC, the International Development Committee in Parliament, what message would you give to them? So I thought, oh crikey, I better take notes because just in case they're listening, because I report to the IDC. And I guess listening to the speakers so far, I've been reassured that the sort of issues we're grappling with at ICAI are really very much on the top of all your agendas, which is great. I mean, in particular, in this sort of second phase of ICAI, we've split up the sort of structure of our, or the taxonomy of our reviews into three areas. We're carrying on with the sort of performance reviews, which were very much the sort of focus of the first 4 years of ICAI's work. But recognising the maturity of many of government's programmes on ODA, we're also looking at impact reviews. And also because so much is changing in the international development space, we've also structured learning reviews to look at new areas where DFID or other government departments are experimenting with new approaches to help to contribute to the thinking and strategies around those new areas. And I was really struck by some of the comments made by the other speakers. I mean, I noted down Luke talking about outcomes being easy to measure, but impacts are much harder. Alice talked about limited resources, so need to sort of think when what is good enough, but also the need to use M&E to learn and do things better going forward. And just as a sort of a plug for the first ICAI impact report that will be coming out in a month or so's time, that's a report I led on the wash sector. And those sort of themes are all themes there, particularly the
just in case anyone doesn't know wash.
Water and sanitation and hygiene. I was listening out to see whether anyone used the acronym AF, whether we've actually had any April Fools yet this morning. So I mean, in the wash sector, one of the big challenges is there's quite a lot of evidence, either at anecdotal level or even specific hard evidence about the wider impacts. But you need to look at these across a much longer time frame than typically international development programs work on, because sustainability is a key issue in WASH, as it is in many sectors. And someone else was talking about that, I think, in relation to infrastructure. And the thing that really resonated with me was Laddie's comment about growing dreams. dreams don't yet feature in DFID's results framework, but maybe this is something we should talk to the Secretary of State about. I guess we would struggle to assess those and evaluate them, but it is a useful test that if in our work we are not day in day out growing dreams, we're probably not doing the job we should be doing. It's great to be back at ODI again. In my past life as head of climate change services at PwC, PwC partnered with ODI on the Climate and Development Knowledge Network. And it's there where I'd like to sort of focus my comments on the lessons from climate finance. I mean, the issues that are being debated today are absolutely not new issues. Policymakers and donors and the private sector have been grappling with these in relation to climate finance and organisations like the Green Climate Fund and so on, since that notorious COP. It's really difficult to speak without using acronyms, isn't it? Conference of Parties in Copenhagen, trying to address just these issues in relation to climate finance. And I think there's some important lessons from that experience which resonate really with a lot that's been said today. Obviously, donor money is never enough, so there's an important role for public money to catalyse private sector investment, but that needs to take care not to crowd out private sector investment or indeed to continue funding when donor funding isn't needed. So it's as much about risk as it is about money, and I think some of the other speakers mentioned that this morning. So innovative approaches in structuring the way finance is provided are important. It isn't just about cash. And when you've made that investment, reporting and verification are key to demonstrating value for money, and that's really what ICAI is all about. So I guess you'd expect me to say that, wouldn't you, really? But there's also a need for safeguards to avoid adverse impacts and unintended consequences. And people have talked about different languages that people use, different terminology. And I was struck by Vivina's comment. She talked about values, about social and environmental and ethical values. And I think sort of private sector probably understands values more than they understand safeguards. In reality, they're talking about, or often talking about, the same sort of issues. And finally, and going back to the point about what's good enough, the need to standardise approaches to both reporting and safeguards to ensure that you're comparing apples with apples, but also to reduce the cost of compliance for business and indeed for donors. So it was really interesting to me when I joined ICE. 1 minute, crikey! Let's cut all that rubbish then. I mean, I'd like to just finish with a comment about the blog about what should be counted as ODA, and to my mind that isn't the most. I mean, it's important, but it's not the most important issue. I mean, I think what's really important is trying to get some sense of would this have happened without donor support? And that's when you've got to count it. If it would have happened anyway, don't count it. But once you've moved beyond that, how quickly are you catalysing other investment? How much investment are you catalysing? And that's a really tricky thing to measure, apart from anything else, because it's looking at a totally different timescale. But that is the holy grail. It was the holy grail, is the holy grail for climate finance. But I think it's also the holy grail for the work that donors are trying to do on impact. There's a huge amount of new thinking going on in this area by donors and by impact investors and others. It's certainly on ICAI's agenda as part of our work in relation to inclusive growth, but also it's very much something we'll be looking at as part of the learning reviews that we've now introduced. So today's session has been great input to that, and I look forward to working with many of you in the future.
Fantastic, thank you. And really sorry, having bullied you, I am going to ask you. You said something really interesting about the two things that you think are important, not what counts as ODA, but would it have happened without donor support, the counterfactual, the additionality? And how quickly do you catalyse other? Now, is there a bit of a tension between those two? Something that's really pretty dreamlike, that donor support can make it happen. It definitely wouldn't have happened without donor support. It was a dream. But maybe it'll still take an awful long time for other money to come in because it's still pretty dreamlike even once it's there. So do you think that some deals are stronger on one of those criteria and some on the other? Or do you see them go together? What have you seen in the climate world?
I mean, I think this is very much a context-specific question, and it isn't just about the individual deal or even the sector you're looking at. It's about addressing risks in that sector, but also creating the institutional context and the broader economic context. And so there's so much need, I think, in many locations to have technical assistance and institutional strengthening going in parallel with the specific investment in sectors. And you've seen this in this isn't a developing country issue. You've seen this in the UK, in the offshore wind industry. Originally deals weren't happening because the development risk was too high on putting up wind turbines offshore. But lo and behold, now there's a real the cost of capital has come down in offshore wind for projects, and there's a secondary market growing now in that sector because government through subsidy supported the initial projects, and that's the sort of what you're trying to achieve, I think, through bringing down the risk, bringing down the cost of capital, encouraging investment, scaling up, and then you can back away from the sector.
So that's picking up Alice's point. It's very much about creating markets, not just about the direct impact of the deal. Thank you very much, Richard. Now we're going to turn to Rob Davis, who is from DFID and from the private sector team in DFID. We'd love to hear more about where DFID thinking is now on this, on development impact, on systemic change, the question of additionality, and whether you use the term subsidy.
Okay, thanks. And firstly, thanks to ODI for putting on this great event and all your partners, CAFOD and others. It's really good, I think, to have such a diverse crowd discussing this issue. There are so many different aspects to it, and actually, where we're really seeing the added value is when they're all coming together. So it's great that we're doing this. I'm just going to talk about three things. I think firstly, just what we're trying to achieve, because I think just keeping the context clear is so important in deciding how we should address these issues. Secondly, about development impact measurement. And thirdly, about additionality and mobilisation, and I'll also try to weave into that a bit on subsidy to talk to the blog language. So I think the first thing just to reflect on though is that we're just talking about one small part of the development effort here, and we shouldn't try to do everything with it. We should do the things that can achieve better than other parts, but we shouldn't try to do everything. And so let's focus on that part of the discussion here. It's not that these instruments are replacing grants, they're sort of complements to grants. So we need to come at this from a lens of where does it work and when is it not the most effective mechanism. I think I'm not going to labour on the point of what we're trying to achieve. I think that's quite clear, but these instruments are very much about a contribution to achieving inclusive, sustainable growth and productive and prosperous economies. And so I'm not going to go into the impact of how that growth leads to poverty reduction. I think that's well evidenced and discussed, or the role of investment in that growth. But I think those are all core parts of our theory of change that we need to sort of keep in view as we go through this. Alice introduced, I think, a really helpful view of sort of three buckets and types of activity that's going on in this space. So firstly, what I call the sort of commercial DFI investment. So about demonstrating commercial investment is possible. So focused on generating economic opportunities, creating jobs, supporting economic transformation by supporting infrastructure investments, parts of the system that can have a greater impact. I think within that, we should remember that is about systemic impact as well. So it is about trying to get investment across that commercial frontier. So whether that's readjusting the risks of commercial investors, they may simply not know what the risks really are because they haven't participated. It may be actually de-risking the sector by reducing reducing some of the risk within it, proving demand, proving proof of concept. Then the sort of second bucket, which I think in the development community we're more comfortable with, which are the impact funds, which are more focused on direct investment, about achieving development outcomes which we can understand and are generally maybe more in social sectors in general. But here as well, there's a systemic impact with them. So in DFID's impact fund, one of our key objectives is to grow the impact investment market. It's not just about the direct impact we're achieving within it. And then third, and I think most interestingly and most novelly, is this area of trying to build markets through investment. So one of the key constraints to achieving impact investment is there just aren't enough good quality deals out there to invest in. And the capability that's brought to putting those deals together, to getting them structured and off the ground and creating businesses which can improve people's lives is really a critical part of this. And I think this is a really interesting area where it's really trying to mesh skills. So it's meshing sort of traditional investment skills from the development finance institutions with the development skills within the development community, but also with sort of business development and entrepreneurial skills. And we have to find a way to mesh those skills and make them work in order for that part of the system to work. So I think we shouldn't think of these buckets as mutually exclusive. We shouldn't think about we necessarily have to have consistency entirely across the piece within them. They're all trying to achieve specific goals. And actually we need all of them. If we create a great pipeline of deals for the DFIs, but there's no one to get them to the commercial frontier, we won't achieve that scale. We won't get them sustainable and happening. So we need the whole range, and we shouldn't sort of compare apples and oranges and pick which bits we like of any of them. So moving on to sort of development impact measurement, and I think firstly, as we've all said, this is critical to get it right. We need to ensure we're getting the best value for money and we're really having impact. We need to be able to communicate the impact of what these instruments do, and we need to have that auditing and oversight role to make sure we're achieving what we want to achieve. I think it's important here that there is a difference between trying to ensure we get the best possible development impact and the way that can then be ex post considered and audited. And we need to build the right parts of the system and focus on what can be achieved at each level. I think there's been really definite progress on harmonisation of indicators. So we've heard about the DFI's harmonisation of indicators, the work the Global Impact Investor Network has done. There's also the DCED standard of thinking about how we think about market change and how we should work through metrics. I mean, I think it's, I can sit here and say that CDC supported businesses in 2014, created 1.3 million direct and indirect jobs. That's being able to say that is a critical part of what we're doing, but that's only a part of their impact, and we need to think about the broader impact. So in many ways, these approaches are, they're taxonomies. As one of my colleagues says, it's the kind of dictionary of results measurement, but dictionaries don't teach you how to read, they teach you what words mean. And really, we need to think, I think, about two things in results measurement that this is focusing on parts that others haven't mentioned. I think the first is really linking in results measurement with business success. So the best projects in this space will align development impact with commercial success. Otherwise, you're at risk of partners' objectives diverging and ending up in strange situations. Where we can get indicators which really build a business's success, the business will want to capture them. There's really great examples of this, I think, in the solar home systems market, where they have incredible data about usage, about what drives uptake, what people really value. Using that data and having that to understand our impact and implement it is a really critical part, and we should think more about that. So rather than just coming with a lens of, this is our view of development impact, this is what it will achieve, let's learn from the businesses as well. What are the key drivers for you? How do they work? And then the second piece, and I think this is really, really challenging, is the systemic change piece. But for me, this is where the real value is in the system. And we really have to think about how we measure systemic change. And this will actually comes and talks to the point of subsidy a lot, because a lot of subsidy is used to achieve systemic change here. We're working in complex adaptive systems, trying to change markets and economies is difficult. How do you attribute? It's very long-term, the impact we have. But we need to be able to understand how we correct our behaviour, how we improve the performance and the return of the return on our investment. This is not just an issue for private finance. I think We focus on it more in private finance, the difficulties, but in sort of governance work within the development community, it's very much also the case. So now I'll just move quickly on to additionality and mobilisation. And I deliberately talk about these together because they're the opposite side of the same coin in many ways. So going back to those three buckets, starting with the commercial DFI bucket, that's all about getting across the commercial frontier. So there you will want to be closer to where the commercial market is. Your additionality will be lower, your mobilisation will be higher. That is just a fact of life, but you need to get across that commercial frontier. Whereas with building the market, what we call leading the way, you are in a space, sorry, I'm going to have to have a drink. You're in a space where you're very additional. No one else will do it. It's not commercial yet. But you're not going to mobilise capital. The returns aren't there. You need to prove the demand is there for products. You need to prove the proof of concept. Those are things the commercial market can't bear risks at that point. But what you're doing is fixing a market failure. You're moving that market for future follow-on investors. And so we need to think about the impact of each part and how we measure them. So just quickly talking about subsidy. Personally, I think subsidy is a bit of a rabbit hole on traditional private sector investment. So actually, the thing the changes to the ODA rules did was it changed the view of what is concessionality for private sector instruments. And it reflected that actually additionality is the right test. So I think we need to think in that lens and actually think there's very little ability to estimate what a subsidy is in those investments, because you want to price them where you think the market should be, but how do you know where the market should be? So you're taking a lot of commercial expertise to try and judge that. So it will be below where the market is. Is that subsidised? Is the market wrong? I just think it becomes a theoretical exercise rather than a practical exercise. But within the leading the way space, I take a very different view. I think this is very much about how, in that space, you are taking additional risk, and that is a reality of life, and you need to make sure you're getting impact for that. So it's thinking about what is that subsidy used for? So correcting market failures, making sure it's time-bound. You know, the subsidy is not about giving a bigger return to a private investor. It is about changing a private investment market so we get more investment in future, so we can get greater policy impact. So I think those aspects of subsidy are critical.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. It's very useful to hear you emphasise this changing markets, the systemic impact, this sort of pioneer approach, and that having more on the additionality, whereas investment in a DFI has more on the, what do you call it, the mobilisation. Yeah. Thank you very much. Finally, I'm delighted to welcome Roberto Ridolfi, the Director for Sustainable Growth and Development in the Directorate General for International Cooperation and Development. You probably do know DG DevCo, but I said it in full. We'd love to hear about the instruments that you're using to catalyse impact through the private sector and how you think about the value of public money in that in those mechanisms.
Thank you very much. Since I'm a stranger, you won't be sort of rude with me with that.
I might be a minute slower to show it to you.
Before I start, 2-3 remarks. First of all, I'm sorry I came late, so I don't know who I'm speaking to. If we divide in 4 categories, consultants, government, CSO, and bankers private, who are you belonging to? CSOs? Thank you. Government? Very few. Private investors or development bankers or private bankers? Very few. And what was the 4th category? Consultants. So all the rest are consultants. Or students or university. Thank you very much. It is important because this shows that there are very angles on how to see I participated in many conversations with private investors. I was, in fact, on the 26th of January in New York, where there was the 7th Investor Summit on climate change. Ban Ki-moon, President Kim, Bloomberg, the president of the Security Commission in the United States, the lady of the Reserve Bank of the United States, big shots, 200-300 people in the room. Who were they? CEOs, managing directors of investment funds. A gentleman stood up and said, you know, today there are $44 trillion in this room. Oh my God. It was the first time that appeared to me the image of people representing money, which is quite shocking if you think to it. But that is, so I asked myself, okay, now I know why I'm here. Because I want your money for development. And I think the convening power of big institutions and actors doing development can help in triggering some of that money into the right direction, sustainable development goals direction, let's say. Okay, now that I know who are you, I shall also react immediately to my three co-panelists here. First of all, I very much like the questions posed by Amy. I will take only two, the one on development impact and additionality. There were too many, far too many, so forget it. I quite share the point of view of Richard on somehow a democratic scrutiny in all this. I do report to the European Parliament, to the Development Commission of the Parliament, and I am the one they should too, right? And the Court of Auditors had a recent audit on blending, which is very relevant for our discussion and conversation today. It was positive, all in all, but when I went there, it didn't look positive. I don't know how, but the MPs managed to put me on the grill very well. And I think that's only fair. However, they did recognize that we should continue on this blending, and that is very important because there is a sort of democratic push and legitimacy that is indeed very much important for us. I would also focus on the key question you pose: would it happen without? Now, let's be a little bit smarter. Would it happen without, or to that extent, or today? Because maybe it would have happened anyway, but in 10 years' time. That is the opening the market, etc., etc. Maybe it would have happened, but in much smaller scale, without that income. So maybe it would have happened, but without the social, environmental constraints that sometimes an ODA actor can impose to a private shark. Don't take me wrong. I was the expert of public-private partnership during enlargement. I was doing this example. During the enlargement of the European Union, you may remember that we had the question of the acquis communautaire. What is this ugly word? Is the ensemble of directive and legislation governing environment, for example, that a country like Poland or Hungary or Romania would have to comply with to enter the Union, right? So they needed a lot of investments. In water, in the water sector, we were dealing with a directive on wastewater, and there was a lot of investment needed to installations in East Europe to get them to the directive standards. The problem was that the grants given to those utilities to get up to the environmental standard will also benefit their profit and loss account, because the technology would improve overall their profit and loss account. So I started defining a sort of windfall profit deriving to the concessionaire in a city, East Europe, due to the grant of the Commission for the compliance with the law. And of course, these big shots, they were started scrambling. What is this? Well, it is that we need to redistribute that windfall profit coming from one reason but generating benefits on another area to the users. So tariff reduction, very complicated. But that is a sense of what I would see in having political actors managing aid. If I am the head of delegation today with the Lisbon Treaty of the European Union, differently from before, I was head of delegation before and after. So ambassador before and after. And before we were an ATM, okay? We were seen as an ATM. Now we are a political actor, talking about human rights, democracy, the rule of law, corruption, and also giving money, but also giving money. And that's much better, I can tell you. Much more difficult, but much better. But that gives an incredible leverage to stimulate a number of actions that are linked to the private sector into development. Essential. So UK is a political actor, the EU is a political actor. Sorry, the World Bank and the EIB are not political actors, and that's right like that. They do their business, but we do our business. And that is essential to justify and to explain, would that happen anyway? In that, are we able to trigger the environmental and social standard for employment in a big investment? These 1.3 million jobs that you mentioned, very good. What kind of jobs are they? Are they jobs at the origin of the tragedy in Bangladesh with a factory on textile, etc.? Hopefully not. So we can exert an additionality on social and environment, which is as important as the additionality on finance. But going back to the third point, and I think you presented very well, Rob, the additionality mobilization equation. And that's true. The farthest you move from the private, where they don't need any public money whatsoever, you go to the fragility, vulnerability, where 100% grant is needed. And we have a number of countries in the world where you can't talk and you shouldn't talk about blending, private sector, sexy things, etc. You shall stick to the security, the vulnerability, children dying, etc., etc., etc. And unfortunately, this is still the case. But exactly for that reason, that you will have a number of 10, 20 countries, hopefully less, that are so vulnerable, so fragile, that you still need to push a lot of grant money for them, you need to reduce the grant money for the others. Because ODA is finite, right? It's not endless. And therefore, in order to reduce, for Kenya today, we can reduce the number of grants, the volume of money for Kenya, if you know Kenya. But you cannot do for Burundi. You cannot do it for South Sudan, right? So increasing money for South Sudan, Burundi, Burkina Faso, and Central African Republic, you can do only if you reduce in Kenya, in Ghana, in South Africa, I don't know, you name it. And you can do it because Kenya doesn't want charity. The narrative of the political dialogue with the leaders is no more on aid, is on investments. And China brought a little bit of a spring factor into our business, I think. Now we have to profit on that. Of course, now the leaders are realizing that the East world culture and narrative is not as good as it looked a few years ago, right? So they come with even more conditions that we do. We come with conditions on homosexuality, we come with conditions on the rule of law and corruption. They come with other conditions, much more hidden under the table, but not as, not light, right? Very heavy. So let me conclude. What we do today is blending 1.0. We are planning for blending 2.0, and I want to tell you also about blending 3.0, the coming versions of blending. Today we take an idea of a Minister of Energy to build a power plant in the middle of nowhere in Congo. Very risky business. You go to the Blackstone, the big energy investment fund in US, and you tell them, are you willing to invest equity there? No way, too risky. Okay, then we plug 20 million, to do the feasibility study, environmental impact assessment, the design, the tender dossier. 20 million, 3-4 years. 3-4 years. The risk was here, 3 years after, 20 million after is here. Then they negotiate, they call the EIB or the Agence Française, hopefully CDC in the coming future, and they say, okay, we are ready with a loan of 1 billion. A loan of different, and some part of equity, etc. Good. The risk goes here. Still, there is a risk there. And perhaps we have to also consider the macroeconomic situation of that country. Can afford that loan? The public finance of the country, the indebtedness. We shall consider that, and we are able to do that, and we must do that. And we do it. So the investment reduction of the risk. I think it is all about risk. It is all about risk. At that conference on the 26th of January in New York, at the end of my intervention, they came to me, these big shots with a lot of money, saying, listen, we would love to talk to you because we perceive you as somebody that's trying to reduce the risk for us to move where else we wouldn't go. And that is exactly what we are trying to do. And that is exactly, imagine 1% of 44 trillion. 1% is more risk. You know, you ask all these CEOs, can you afford to risk 1% of your overall operations in Burkina Faso or South Sudan? And that is $440 billion. So it's a little bit of a big boost for our development efforts, right? And that is where we are. Blending 2.0 is that 20 million that we are giving to reduce the risk are not a sunk cost, are not a grant. But once that you have signed the contract with the government, once that the project goes ahead with the big money of the development bankers and also private investors, at that moment in time, my 20 million must come back in the loan so that you give back to me and I do it more. Number two, when there is an energy, a power plant, and today our development bankers, they like sovereign guarantees. They don't move without sovereign guarantees, except few exceptions. And that creates an indebtedness of countries. Then we ask them, listen, when there is a cash flow linked to the investment, you do not ask a government guarantee. Should be enough the political protection of the risk that me as political actor, I'm giving you. And that is start to work. So we are in 2.0. Then we have to do more, broader sections. So the blending traditional was on infrastructure, now it's on everything, agriculture, etc. Where is the blending 3.0? And I conclude. And that is something that really we are reasoning in the last days. We need to see the SDGs and the 169 targets as something that cannot be handled without mainstreaming them into the financial markets as they are. Either we change the financial market, I don't have any idea or any hope to do it, or we mainstream whatever we have in the 169 targets. I prefer to use 169 targets rather than 17 SDGs, into the financial markets. The example I'm trying to do is on biodiversity. Biodiversity is a fantastic development stroke environment stroke sustainability experience that I suggest to all of you. We are financing projects in agriculture, in ecosystems, in order to show that biodiversity has got a very strong economic value. Now, how can you use biodiversity if in Wall Street or here at the City of London, you don't have an index where the big investors can follow the trend and therefore deciding to invest? That's what Bloomberg did 10, 15 years ago. And now look at where are the renewables in the financial markets. So let's think, that is for me blending 3.0, which is blending without aid, in fact. It is, pushing the SDGs and the 169 into a new dimension, creating the conditions, because the nerd investing, sorry for the definition, in Wall Street, they don't care about what is behind the index, as long as the index goes up. They push the money. I have this naive image of Wall Street, right? But it's not so far from reality, I can tell you that. So, but if they don't have an index representing what biodiversity, or indeed any other of the 169 important elements does, they will not invest in it, simply because there are no data, statistical and trendy, to follow and to invest on. I would like to conclude here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Wow, thank you very much for that tour of the progress of blending, where it's come from and where you think it's going. I actually want to pose you quite a difficult question. Well, other people, please be ready with your questions. You didn't use the phrase value for money, But so many of the points you made were implicitly about value for money. The fact that you're giving cash grant to Kenya isn't delivering the value for money you can get by putting it somewhere else, so you use different instruments now in Kenya. And you talked about the different ways that you can deploy money through various blending approaches. 20 million in feasibility study, all kinds of things. Sitting where you're sitting, how do you begin to compare alternative uses of funds as a guarantee, as a 20 million for a viable feasibility assessment? You've got so many options in your blending 1.0, 2.0, 3.0 sectors. I'm sure you don't have an Excel framework at this point, but in terms of what's happening in your head, how are you even approaching this analysis?
Well, so far the demand is not so big that you have to get into choices.
Okay.
Right? There are not so many, well, if the alternative is a pure grant, a check to the government to do private sector development in Kenya, or creating a blending, the option is only for my people, the staff of the European Union, or indeed DFID, to work less or more, because to do blending operations you need to work much more and elaborate on this additionality, etc., etc., etc. But in terms of demand, we are just coping with the demand. So there is not a big, today we are evaluating a big guarantee instrument. And of course guarantees, any financial expert will tell you, the bigger they are, the better they work. The broader coverage and the biodiversity of risks they must cover, the better for the guarantees to work. And that's where we are looking at. Look at the export credit companies in the European Union. 28 export credit companies giving guarantees to companies. Let's imagine to put them all together and create a big, enormous guarantee. You will have immediately a massive increase in direct investments of European entrepreneurs into emerging and developing markets. Immediate. Of course, if you do it nationally, then you are sort of tiding your aid somehow. I don't want to use the ugly word. We don't want to tide anything. I want to free you up from that. So we want to expand the range of opportunities. But so far we are demand driven. The blending allocates 300 million for East Africa in blending modality, and it's up to the financial institutions to come up with ideas. If we have more than 300 million, of course we try to take different approaches. And in the screening, we use the principles that were approved by the Communication on Private Sector, by the Commission, approved by the Council. Measurable development impact, additionality, neutrality, shared interest and co-financing, demonstration effect, adherence to social, environmental, and fiscal standards. But I think today the level is higher, is how to do it, how to ensure. The screening we are using is a complex one, but the peer review is also interesting. The fact that we operate in an environment of competition helps a lot. I don't have only projects from the European Investment Bank. I have a project from the EIB, Agence Française, KfW from Germany, CDC or Cassa Depositi e Prestiti in Italy. So I have different people proposing the same thing with different approaches, and that's very, very healthy.
Thank you very much. Questions, please. Yes, we have 1, 2, and then 3. Please.